They say Charleston was built on elegance, sugar, and silence. But beneath the candlelit parlors and the glitter of wealth, there were whispers of something older, something that reeked not of perfume and roses, but of smoke, salt, and blood. Tonight, we open the forgotten book of the Bellamy family, a dynasty so rich, so powerful, and so untouchable that even their sins were gilded. But money cannot hide the stench of rot forever. Imagine Charleston in the late 1790s, cobblestone streets glowing beneath oil lamps, carriages creaking over the damp stones, the air thick with the smell of the harbor, salt, tar, and rotting. Fish. Mansions lined the avenues, their iron gates twisting like skeletal ribs against the moonlight. Among them, none were more admired, nor more feared, than the estate of Elias Bellamy. Elias was not just wealthy, he was untouchably wealthy. His plantation stretched from Carolina rice fields to Caribbean sugar islands. His ships carried silk, spice, and secrets across oceans. And yet, neighbors whispered that his fortune did not come from trade alone. There were rumors, always rumors, that his wealth was rooted in something darker. They said the Bellamys had brought back more than just sugar from the islands. One winter night in 1793, a strange procession wound its way into Charleston under cover of darkness. Witnesses, servants, drunks, sailors who dared to speak, told of crates unloaded from Bellamy ships, heavy crates that rattled with chains. Some swore they heard whimpering inside. But what terrified them most wasn't the sound of human voices. It was the smell. A sour metallic tang, like blood baked into wood. The crates were wheeled straight into the Bellamy cellar. From that night forward, neighbors claimed the Bellamy estate changed. Lights burned in the mansion at unnatural hours. Candles glowed through shuttered windows at midnight, accompanied by faint rhythmic drumming that seemed to vibrate through the cobblestones. Horses would rear when passing the house. Dogs barked furiously and then fell silent, as if their throats had been cut by the night itself. Inside, Elias Bellamy's wife, Margaret, began to waste away. Once the belle of Charleston, her skin grew pale, her eyes sunken, her laughter gone. Servants whispered of her screams at night, piercing wails that were quickly muffled. The doctor claimed it was a female malady, but those who worked closest to the family told another story. They said Margaret had been forced to take part in Elias's rituals, that in the great parlor, beneath crystal chandeliers with velvet curtains drawn tight, Elias and his circle of wealthy men gathered around chalk markings etched into the floor. Bowls of salt, jars of ash, symbols daubed in pig's blood, though many swore it was human. And in the center, Margaret. They said she wasn't a wife anymore. She was offering. The first disappearance was dismissed as coincidence. A housemaid gone missing, then a stable boy, then a sailor who had demanded extra pay after unloading Bellamy's mysterious crates. Each time the Bellamy fortune seemed to swell, new ships, new land, new jewels on Margaret's skeletal neck, and then came the night Charleston still whispers about. It was late summer 1796. The air was heavy, the harbor swollen with storms. Neighbors awoke to the sound of chanting drifting from the Bellamy estate. Not drunken songs, not prayers, but something low, guttural, almost inhuman. Those who dared to look claimed they saw firelight spilling from the cellar windows. The smoke that rose wasn't from wood. It carried the rancid stench of burning, hair and flesh. One neighbor, a widow named Abigail Trenton, told her pastor what she saw. Men in masks, circling, shadows twisting in unnatural shapes on the walls. In the center, a figure tied, struggling, screaming until the chanting peaked and the scream was cut short. No one ever saw the boy again. By dawn, the firelight was gone, the house silent. And on that very morning, Elias Bellamy announced a staggering expansion of his empire, acquiring 3 plantations overnight as though the deed had been waiting signed in blood. Charleston society applauded him, toasted him, called him the future of America. But the servants, they whispered. They swore that night after the ritual, Margaret had not been herself. They said she sat at the breakfast table, eyes glazed, lips moving silently, as though whispering to someone no one else could see. Her hands trembled so violently that the silver fork clattered to the floor, and when a servant stooped to retrieve it, Margaret hissed, an animal sound, guttural, unrecognizable as human. And then came the curse. In October 1796, the Trenton widow, the one who had confessed what she saw, was found dead. Her body was discovered at dawn, slumped in the pew of her church, her face locked in terror, mouth stretched wide as if she had screamed her last breath. No wounds, no blood, nothing, except her eyes. They had turned completely black. The church hushed the scandal. Her death was blamed on apoplexy, a sudden fit. But among the poor, among the slaves, among the sailors who trafficked in whispers, the truth spread. The Bellamys had struck again. They had silenced the only witness. And that was the night Charleston began to fear the Bellamy name. They say the Bellamy mansion still carries the sound of those chants. If you stand outside on a stormy night, that the cellar doors rattle when the tide is high, as if something inside is trying to escape. But perhaps the most chilling tale comes from a young servant girl who claimed she saw Margaret Bellamy wandering the halls at midnight. Only, it wasn't Margaret anymore. Her gown dragged along the floor, soaked in something dark. Her hands were streaked red, though she carried no candle. And when the servant girl dared to call out, "Madam!" Margaret's head snapped around. Her eyes were not human. They burned like embers. The girl fainted on the spot. By morning she was gone. No trace, no body, no name written in the household ledger. The Bellamys carried on. Their wealth grew. And Charleston learned the rule that would last for generations. You do not ask what happens inside the Bellamy mansion after dark. Charleston's humidity hung heavy in the night air, so thick it seemed to choke the lungs of anyone who dared step onto Meeting Street. The lamps that lined the cobblestone flickered faintly, their flames quivering like frightened children. And in the grand house of the Bellamys, the wealthiest, most untouchable family in South Carolina, a gathering was underway, one that no outsider would ever be meant to see. By day, their mansion glittered like an emblem of success. Carved oak doors, imported marble, sprawling verandas framed by ivory columns. It was a symbol of everything wealth could buy. But by night it was something else. A temple. A cage. A stage for rituals that would make the strongest hearts falter. Edward, Bellamy, patriarch of the family, descended the winding staircase beneath the estate, carrying with him a silver candelabrum. The flames illuminated his face in fractured shadows, revealing a man who seemed both regal and monstrous. His eyes had the hollow brilliance of someone consumed by obsession. The cellar was no ordinary storage of wine or goods. It was a chamber carved deeper into the soil, lined with brick that dripped with moisture. Strange carvings marked the walls. Spirals, crude symbols, and words in languages no one in Charleston could understand. Tonight his wife Margaret followed. Her silk gown trailed along the steps, but her face was pale, her lips trembling. Behind them came their eldest son, William, who carried a chest bound in iron locks. The chest rattled faintly as though something inside still lived. From upstairs, the muffled hum of Charleston's wealthy elite echoed through the ballroom where guests danced, drank, and praised the Bellamy's fortune. They had no idea what was happening beneath their feet. Edward had built his empire on trade, cotton, indigo, rice. But everyone whispered that no merchant alone could grow so rich, so fast. His ships always returned full while others rotted, at sea. His crops thrived even when his neighbors withered under drought. And then there were the tragedies. Competitors found dead, rivals ruined, enemies vanished. No proof ever tied Edward to the disasters, but the pattern was too clean, too perfect. Those who dared suggest foul play often disappeared. Those who asked too many questions learned that Charleston itself seemed to protect the Bellamys. Judges, lawyers, even ministers owed them favors. But money wasn't the true root of their protection. It was something far older, far darker. As Edward set the candelabrum upon a stone altar, William placed the iron chest before it. He kneeled, his face rigid but his hands shaking. Edward unlocked the chest. Inside, bound and gagged, was a young man no older than 20. His eyes bulged in terror, and muffled screams tore against the cloth gag. Margaret turned away, clutching her rosary with white knuckles. She had long stopped believing. The beads offered her salvation. "Be silent," Edward hissed, his voice echoing. He reached into the chest and pulled the man forward, laying him against the altar. The boy thrashed, his breath fast and panicked. William held him down, though his own tears brimmed in his eyes. He had done this before, but each time it hollowed him further. Edward began to chant, not in English, not in French, but in a harsh, guttural tongue that reverberated in the marrow of the bones. The cellar seemed to grow colder, the walls dripping not with water but with a thick, dark ooze. The symbols carved in the brick seemed to shimmer faintly, as if alive. Margaret could no longer contain herself. "Edward, please," she whispered. Her voice shook. "Not again. The neighbors are beginning to ask. The servants grow suspicious. We have enough wealth." Her husband turned on her with such fury that she staggered back. "Enough?" His eyes burned. "You think what we have is enough? Wealth fades, land rots. But power, true power, demands blood, and the price must always be paid." He seized a silver dagger from the altar, its blade etched with the same strange runes as the walls. Margaret pressed her hands over her mouth, stifling her sob. William closed his eyes, muttering a prayer under his breath even as he restrained the boy. The blade came down. The scream that followed was swallowed by the cellar walls. Edward Bellamy didn't kill for pleasure. He killed for a contract. Decades earlier, when the Bellamys were just another struggling merchant family, Edward had made a pact. Historians never wrote of it, preachers never admitted it, but whispers claimed he had journeyed far into the swamps of South Carolina where ancient stones jutted from the earth like teeth. There he offered his soul, his bloodline, and every drop of blood he could spill in exchange for wealth and dominion. What answered him wasn't God, and it wasn't human. Thabri. Chamber vibrated as Edward placed the blade wet with crimson upon the altar. The body lay limp, but Edward's chanting grew louder, shaking the air itself. The candle flames bent unnaturally, as though being sucked inward toward some unseen force. Margaret cried out as the walls themselves seemed to pulse like a living thing. The carvings glowed red, dripping a light like molten iron. And then, silence. The boy's body convulsed once, then stilled. His blood pooled into the grooves of the altar, running through channels carved into the stone. The liquid flowed in unnatural directions, crawling upward against gravity, filling the symbols until the whole altar burned with a crimson glow. Edward smiled. He raised his hands. "We are eternal." At that moment, a deep rumble rolled through the earth, though no storm brewed outside. Somewhere above, the music of the ballroom faltered for just a second, glasses clinking, violins squeaking, as if the world itself had shivered. Margaret fell to her knees, clutching her chest. William stepped back, pale and shaking, his hands splattered in blood, and the boy's eyes snapped open. But they were no longer his eyes. They glowed a sickly gold, staring unblinking at Margaret, at William, at Edward. His lips parted. A voice, not his own, spoke in a guttural growl. "The pact is kept, but the debt is never paid in full." The candles blew out. The Bellamy cellar plunged into darkness, broken only by the echo of that voice. The family had secured their fortune once more, but what they had awakened would not rest quietly. And, as Charleston slept above, oblivious, something beneath the Bellamy estate began to stir. The Charleston summer of 1794 carried a heat so heavy it pressed against the skin like wet cloth. Inside the Bellamy estate, however, the atmosphere was not one of languid ease. Servants whispered in the corners, their eyes darting toward the children of Elias and Margaret Bellamy. For while the father's wealth and the mother's beauty kept the city enchanted, the children were becoming the true objects of unease. They were perfect, too perfect. Rosalind, the eldest daughter, had eyes the color of molten gold, an unnatural shade no one in the family tree had possessed. The twins, Daniel and Joseph, moved in eerie synchronization, finishing each other's sentences before the other could even speak. Little Catherine, the youngest, seemed never to sleep. Her governess swore that even at midnight she would find the child sitting upright in her bed, humming lullabies in a language that could not be traced to any land, and yet the townspeople could not look away. The Bellamy children radiated a strange charm, a magnetic pull that made guests laugh too, loudly in their presence or linger in rooms where they had no business being. But when they left, they complained of headaches, of vague nausea, of dreams that haunted them for weeks. Rumors began to spread. One evening, a servant named Samuel was ordered to fetch a ledger from the cellar. But when he pushed the iron door open, he discovered more than wine racks and barrels. The floor was etched with chalk, forming a circle, its symbols jagged and archaic. At the center, candles burned low and steady, their wax black as tar. And there, seated within the circle, were the Bellamy children. They were chanting. Samuel froze, the ledger slipping from his hands. Their voices were too measured, too practiced. It was not the mimicry of play, but the cadence of ritual. Rosalind's eyes glowed faintly in the candlelight as she lifted a small bird, its wings bound, its beak sealed with twine. With a whispered word, she snapped its neck, laying it gently into the flames. The smell of burning feathers filled the cellar, acrid and suffocating. The children turned in unison and saw Samuel. Their smiles, serene, knowing, were the last thing he remembered before collapsing. He was found the next morning at the edge of the marsh barefoot, with no memory of how he had gotten there. He swore never to set foot in the Bellamy house again. Margaret Bellamy, once the darling of Charleston society, was changing too. Her skin grew pale, her hair brittle, her once radiant laughter now hollow and sharp. Neighbors whispered she no longer recognized her friends, that she recoiled from Holy Scripture, and that mirrors were discreetly removed from the mansion's upper floors. Some claimed they saw her at night, pacing the gardens barefoot, her gown soaked through as if she had walked into the fountains. Others swore she was not alone, that shadowy figures lingered just out of reach, always a step behind her, vanishing when approached. One night, a guest overheard her murmuring in the parlor, "They promised me eternal life, but what they took in exchange, I cannot bear it." The guest left Charleston the very next morning. By now, the Bellamy's fortune had become a stain upon Charleston's conscience. Ships owned by Elias returned with gold heavier than seemed possible, yet entire crews were replaced between voyages. Their estate expanded, swallowing neighboring lands, but the families who sold to Elias often left the city entirely. Speaking of an oppressive weight that had fallen over their homes, Charleston's church leaders whispered of unnatural dealings. But Elias Bellamy was too powerful, too embedded in commerce, politics, and society. To challenge him was to risk ruin. So the whispers grew, but action never came. And yet, Charleston was not safe. Strange accidents plagued the streets, carriages overturned with no apparent cause. Livestock were found drained of blood in the fields. Children reported hearing voices calling from the Bellamy estate, promising games and sweets if they would only come closer to the gates. It was not until the disappearance of young Grace Whitaker, daughter of a wealthy merchant, that suspicion turned to horror. Witnesses swore they had last seen her near the Bellamy estate, her bonnet caught in the iron fence. Her family begged Elias and Margaret to open their home for a search, but the Bellamys refused, citing private affairs. Days later, Grace's bonnet reappeared, hanging neatly on the Bellamy's front door. The whispers grew into shouts, but when constables demanded entry, they found nothing. At first. The mansion was immaculate, its halls gleaming, its parlors adorned with imported silks and polished mahogany. Then one constable forced open a locked room in the north wing. Inside was a sight none would forget. The walls were painted black, the floor covered in salt, bones arranged in intricate spirals around a central chair. Upon that chair sat Rosalind Bellamy, calm and poised, her golden eyes unblinking. At her feet, a small doll dressed in Grace Whittaker's clothes. But there was no Grace. The constables fled the mansion without explanation, and the Whittaker family left Charleston within a week, abandoning their trade and their home. By the turn of the century, the Bellamy family had become less of a household and more of a legend, a tale to frighten children into obedience. Parents told their young, "Do not stray after dusk, or the Bellamy children will call you into the marsh." Servants refused to stay past sundown. Priests avoided their land entirely. But inside the mansion, the Bellamys thrived. Elias grew wealthier, Margaret more withdrawn, and the children, those perfect, haunting children, aged with a grace that unsettled everyone. For though the years passed, the Bellamy children never seemed to grow older. The mansion stood silent, its grand facade cloaked in the heavy fog that rolled in from the harbor. By now, the whispers surrounding the Bellamys had grown into a roar. Servants fled under cover of night, and even Charleston's bravest men refused to cross the estate's threshold. But not all who entered did so willingly. One cold evening in 1797, neighbors reported hearing what sounded like a woman screaming. The sound tore through the stillness of the city's upper district, echoing across cobblestone streets like a death wail. And it came unmistakably from the Bellamy estate. Inside, the truth was far more horrifying than rumor could imagine. In the highest part of the mansion, sealed behind locked doors and thick curtains, lived Eliza Bellamy, the family's eldest daughter. She had not been seen in public for nearly 5 years. When she was 16, society was told she had fallen ill. But in truth, Eliza had been hidden away, not sick, but cursed. Visitors described hearing scratching behind the walls, sometimes even footsteps pacing just above the nursery, though no one was allowed to go upstairs. A maid who once slipped into the forbidden rooms claimed Eliza's face bore strange markings, as if the skin itself had been carved with symbols. The family told her she was chosen, marked to carry the weight of the rituals passed down by her ancestors. Her body was not her own. It belonged to the Bellamy fortune, to the ancient powers that fed it. Charleston was already steeped in dread. Yet the revelations about Eliza pulled the veil further. She had been raised not as a daughter, but as an offering. Each night she was forced to sit in the attic's candle-lit circle, surrounded by symbols drawn in chalk and ash. Witnesses later recalled seeing smoke rise unnaturally from the mansion's chimney even when the hearths were cold. Some swore they heard chanting carried on the wind, low, guttural in a tongue no one could place. The Bellamys claimed they were safeguarding her, shielding Charleston from something worse. But those who saw Eliza knew better. The family was feeding her to the darkness. One evening, a servant boy named Samuel, desperate for escape, crept into the attic. What he found broke him. Eliza was there, her hair matted, her wrists bruised from bindings. Around her lay bones, small ones, not of animals, but of children. Samuel fled in terror, but was captured before he could leave the grounds. His body was discovered 2 days later floating in the Ashley River, his mouth stuffed with herbs used in Bellamy rituals. It was the first time Charleston truly understood. The Bellamys weren't just wealthy merchants. They were harbingers of death. From this point, the mansion itself seemed alive. Neighbors swore the windows bled candlelight even when unlit, and strange figures could be seen watching from the upper floor, sometimes Eliza, sometimes someone, or something else. Servants who remained described waking to find their beds shaking violently, as if someone stood at the foot demanding their attention. One wrote in his journal that he felt the house swallowing my breath as though I were inside its lungs. The Bellamy's fortune, it seemed, came at a price too monstrous to hide. By 1799, the truth could no longer be ignored. A fire broke. Out in the mansion, consuming much of the upper floors. In the ashes of the attic, townsfolk discovered something impossible: a second skeleton, small and frail, beside Eliza's burned body. Yet records showed only one daughter. The city was left with a question that haunts Charleston's archives to this day. Who was the second child, and why was it hidden? The night Charleston seemed to turn its face away from the Bellamys, the city itself appeared cloaked in a restless fog. The streets were quiet, unusually so, as if even the stray dogs and tavern drunkards had learned to keep their distance from the Bellamy estate. Rumors had spread like wildfire: disappearances, unexplainable shadows on the family's property, faint cries in the dead of night that no neighbor dared to confirm. But what chilled the town most was the silence of the Bellamys themselves. Behind the marble columns of their mansion, something had shifted. Samuel Bellamy, once the embodiment of Southern hospitality, now locked himself away in his study for days on end, emerging with bloodshot eyes and ink-stained hands. He had begun drafting new ledgers, records not of business, but of names. Every ledger was marked with cryptic notes beside each name, some crossed out with violent slashes, others circled in thick black ink, as if waiting for something. Eleanor, the matriarch, was no longer seen attending church. When questioned, she smiled faintly and whispered, "Our salvation does not come from the pulpit." Those words carried like a curse through Charleston, lodging in the minds of those who heard them. And the children? Neighbors swore they had seen them wandering the estate grounds barefoot at night, their eyes wide open though their faces were slack like sleepwalkers. Some whispered that the children were not truly themselves anymore, that something else looked out from behind those young eyes. One stormy evening, as lightning clawed at the sky and rain lashed the cobblestones, a figure arrived at the mansion. Witnesses later said he seemed to step with the storm, his cloak heavy with rain but his stride unbothered, purposeful. It was the same stranger Samuel had met years before, the man with eyes like dull embers, who had offered him the original contract. He was welcomed in. No servant dared ask why. Behind closed doors, Samuel and Eleanor spoke with him at length. The servants, pressed against the walls in fear, claimed to hear murmured chanting, the sound of nails scratching against wood, and at one point, a woman's scream, though no woman had been seen entering. When the stranger left, Samuel followed, him only to the door, clutching a folded parchment in trembling hands. His face bore a mixture of triumph and terror. Eleanor kissed the stranger's hand before he vanished back into the storm. From that night on, Charleston's tragedies worsened. Livestock were found drained of blood in the fields. A merchant's daughter vanished without a trace. The sea itself seemed angry, dragging ships into its black depths without warning. And always when disaster struck, the Bellamys thrived. Their wealth expanded, their influence grew, and their mansion, once a place of laughter, pulsed like a dark cathedral above the town. It was in late autumn, when the nights grew colder and the fog thickened, that the servants reported the family had taken to gathering in a locked chamber deep beneath the house. This chamber was said to contain no windows, only tall mirrors lined along the walls. Through a crack in the stone, one servant dared to watch. Inside, Eleanor stood before a mirror, her children in a circle behind her. Samuel knelt at the center, blood dripping from his palm as he pressed it against the polished glass. And then, the reflection moved. The servant swore that Samuel's reflection did not mimic him, but instead reached forward, pressing its hand against his from the other side. Eleanor began chanting in a language no one recognized, her voice low and guttural, while the children swayed rhythmically, their eyes glazed. The mirror trembled. Shadows spilled from it like smoke, twisting, curling, then seeping across the floor. The servant fled before he could see more. Days later, his body was found floating in the harbor, mouth frozen in a scream, eyes wide open as if he had drowned in terror rather than water. Whispers became accusations. The church leaders, trembling in their pulpits, denounced the Bellamys as heretics. Some even called them devil worshippers. But the family's power was so immense, so deeply woven into the city's trade, courts, and politics, that no one dared confront them openly. And yet, A quiet resistance stirred. A small group of townsfolk, merchants who had lost sons, mothers who had lost daughters, fishermen whose boats had been swallowed by the sea, gathered in secret. They vowed that if the Bellamys had indeed made a pact, they would find a way to break it, no matter the cost. They studied old texts brought from Europe, consulted sailors who whispered of occult practices in far-off ports, and pieced together a theory. The Bellamys had bound themselves to an ancient covenant, one that demanded sacrifice, one that promised eternal prosperity at the expense of everyone around them. The only way to undo it was to destroy the family's mirrors, the supposed gateways through which the pact was renewed. The conspirators prepared for weeks, waiting for the right night when the family would be gathered in their ritual chamber. They carried torches, axes, and a holy symbol carved hastily by a trembling priest. But when they stormed the mansion, they did not find what they expected. The house was silent. Too silent. The grand hall was empty. The chandeliers swayed, though. No wind touched them. Every portrait on the walls seemed to watch, eyes gleaming faintly in the dim light. And when they descended into the cellar, expecting to find the family mid-ritual, the room stood barren. No children, no mirrors, only the faint smell of blood and ash. Yet one of the walls dripped with moisture. When a man touched it, he swore the stone was breathing. Then came the sound. Faint footsteps above them, soft laughter, and the voice of a child singing a lullaby no one recognized. The conspirators fled in terror. Not one dared to return. The Bellamys remained untouchable, their wealth undiminished, their influence unshaken. Yet Charleston itself began to rot around them. The river grew black, sickness spread, and neighbors whispered that the city was cursed, not by God's wrath, but by the unholy bargain struck by its most powerful family. And still, within the mansion, the mirrors waited. They say the wealth of Charleston rests on the bones of the enslaved, but in the case of the Bellamy family, the bones were not buried, they were kept. When the present-day historian Margaret Whitlow stood at the gates of the Bellamy estate ruins, she felt a coldness that no southern summer sun could burn away. The house had long since collapsed, the land choked by wild vines and oak roots, but the silence carried a weight, as though the soil itself remembered screams. Margaret had been chasing whispers for years. Local archives spoke of the family's fortune, yes, but also of rituals that blurred the line between wealth and damnation. What she hadn't expected was how much the townspeople still feared the Bellamys, even 2 centuries later. Some warned her away with trembling hands. Others only shook their heads, muttering, "The Bellamys don't stay in the ground." Her first night in Charleston, Margaret stayed at an inn across from the cemetery where the Bellamys were supposedly interred. But at midnight, as she leaned from her window, she swore she saw lanterns flickering between the gravestones. Not the cold electric glow of tourists or caretakers, but warm, firelit circles bobbing slowly as if carried by unseen hands. The next morning, the caretaker dismissed her concerns. "No Bellamys there, miss, not in my cemetery. They kept their own burial ground, out by the marshes." Margaret's heart pounded. If the Bellamys had their own ground, why had records insisted otherwise? The deeper she dug, the clearer it became. The Bellamys had never allowed their dead to be claimed by Charleston's consecrated earth. They had built their own resting place, hidden, secret, and unholy, guided by fading maps and the hushed directions of an old archivist. Margaret ventured into the overgrown marshland beyond the ruins. The air was heavy with rot, the buzzing of insects, and the distant cries of birds that never dared to land too close. Hours passed before she found it. A low wall of crumbling brick half swallowed by mud. At its center was a sunken mausoleum, its entrance sealed with rusted iron doors. The carvings above the lintel were unlike any Charleston headstone she had seen, symbols closer to African ritual than European, woven with biblical verses scratched. Out halfway through, her skin prickled as she traced the markings. This was not a resting place. It was a prison, and something inside still waited. That night, Margaret returned with a lantern and crowbar. She should have turned back. She admitted as much in her final recording. But the pull of the mystery outweighed fear. With each strike, the corroded locks gave way until the mausoleum groaned open with the scent of stagnant air. She stepped into darkness. The walls were lined with coffins, stacked one upon another, but not a single one was nailed shut. Their lids were cracked, shifted aside, as if their occupants had risen of their own accord. Bones lay strewn across the floor, mingled with strands of decayed clothing, rings still gleaming on skeletal fingers. And then came the whispers. Not wind, not imagination, but voices, dozens, layered over one another, some pleading, some chanting, all circling Margaret's ears like a noose. Blood was promised. Blood must return. She dropped her lantern. The glass shattered, flame sputtering out, and in that instant of suffocating dark she felt it. Cold hands brushing against her ankles, tugging at her sleeves, reaching. Margaret fled. She burst into the home of the archivist who had guided her, shaking, mud-stained, insisting she had seen the Bellamys with her own eyes. The old man only nodded, his face pale. They never died, not properly. You see, miss, the Bellamys, they bound their souls to the land. That's how their riches grew while others withered. But fortune demands balance. They fed the land with blood, and the land fed them back. Margaret asked why no one had destroyed the mausoleum. Why had Charleston lived beside such horror? The archivist's gaze fell. Because Bellamy gold still pays this town's debts, still funds its churches, still runs through our veins. Destroy them, and Charleston starves. And then he whispered the words Margaret would never forget. Some families inherit homes. We inherited the Bellamys. Margaret's recordings end abruptly 3 days later. The innkeeper remembered her leaving with papers and maps tucked under her arm, headed back toward the marsh. She never returned. Search parties found only her satchel near the mausoleum wall, soaked with brackish water. Her body was never recovered. But weeks later, a farmer claimed he saw a woman in the marsh at dusk, her face pale, her dress torn, her eyes blank as she drifted between the reeds. Others swore they heard her voice on the wind, whispering warnings, and still the lanterns burn at night among the graves. The Bellamys of Charleston were once America's wealthiest family, their fortune unmatched, their power unchallenged. But what they traded for wealth did not die with them. Even now, their mausoleum sinks deeper into the marsh, its iron doors rusting, its coffins yawning open. Some say the family waits, hungry for new heirs to continue the ritual. Others believe they have already chosen one, that the historian who sought their truth is now among them, her voice joining the eternal chorus that echoes through the swamp. And if you ever find yourself walking Charleston's outskirts on a moonless night, and you see lantern light where no man should walk, remember this: the Bellamys never buried their dead, and perhaps they never will. The end.